The Joe Cox Foundation was established in 2016 by the friends and family of the late Jo Cox MP. The foundation exists to build a positive legacy for Jo and to create something positive from the tragedy that was her murder. Today, we work to achieve three main goals. Locally, we work to build compassionate, well-connected communities where everyone has a sense of identity and belonging. We do this by bringing people together through the Great Get Together, our More in Common network, and as our response to COVID-19, the work of the Connection Coalition, building on the pioneering work of the Jo Cox Commission on Loneliness. Nationally, we work to build a better public life through tackling abuse and intimidation, encouraging cross-party work on important issues, and inspiring the next generation of women and young people by helping to dismantle the barriers to participation. Internationally, we support organisations and initiatives which champion the humanitarian causes Jo cared about. In particular, this work focuses on the empowerment of women and girls and the prevention of identity-based violence. Our work is underpinned by Jo's belief that we have more in common than that which divides us. Building stronger communities has always been at the heart of what we do. The public response to Jo's murder in 2016 demonstrated how strongly people across the UK wanted to bring their communities together and to do something positive in Jo's memory. With this collective energy behind them, in 2017 Jo's friends and family united to establish the Great Get Together. The Great Get Together is a weekend of community-led events through which people from all backgrounds can forge genuine connections. Events come in all shapes and sizes, ranging from street parties to sports days, community lunches to school assemblies, all led by grassroots volunteers. We believe that these supporters have the potential to transform their communities, but we know that this requires sustained effort. That's why we're working to transition from moment to movement, where the Great Get Together becomes a springboard for longer-term community activism, supported by our More in Common network. The More in Common network is a collection of local groups across the UK promoting Jo's powerful humanitarian message within their communities. From healing Brexit divisions in Boston to tackling loneliness in Basildon, each group brings together local people from different backgrounds to build stronger, more compassionate communities. In 2020, we have all been affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Many have been exposed to loneliness and social isolation, and we wanted to call on the nation to prioritise connection and emotional well-being. We founded the Connection Coalition in March, and it quickly grew to over 500 members, representing the many perspectives of the UK's loneliness crisis for people of all backgrounds. The coalition aims to support local organisations to build meaningful connections and ensure acts of kindness and compassion continue beyond the crisis. Jo remains at the heart of everything we do. Her values guide us and her spirit lives on in those she continues to inspire. We want to thank all of our supporters who have helped us to continue building Jo's legacy every day, and for believing that we really do have more in common than that which divides us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Jo Cox Memorial Lecture. My name is Barbara Stocking, and I'm president of Murray Edwards College. And we're sitting here in the lecture hall, but I just want to reassure you that we're completely adhering to the guidelines, and are actually just 6 of us here. So we're looking to very many questions from you out there to keep the conversation going. Now, this lecture series was set up by the Department of Sociology in Cambridge because Jo was a student there. In fact, she studied what was then called archaeology and anthropology. She was also a member of Pembroke College, and the chair of the Jo Cox Feminist Society, Safa Al-Azami, is going to be the person chairing the question and answer after the talk, and she's already sitting here. So why then are we having this lecture in Murray Edwards College? Well, the reason is that I worked very closely with Jo for about 9 years together in Oxfam, when she was the head of advocacy and was really doing very serious work, particularly on trying to stop conflicts in countries like Sudan and in the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, But of course, also challenging on the bigger issues, inequality, whether that was national or international. So she then left Oxfam, and as we know, she became an MP. And at that time, of course, some of her interests became much more UK-oriented. Issues of inequality in this country, but as mentioned in the film as well, loneliness, and pressing above all for all of us to work together. Because and I think the phrase that she used that just sticks with us all the time, the resonant phrases, we have more in common than divides us. So she worked to that principle. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I have to remind everyone that today, this very day, is 5 years since Jo Cox was killed up in Batley. And I thought we might just stop for a moment or two, just to think about her personally. Obviously with sadness, but mostly, I hope, to remember all Jo's incredible energy, her preparedness to challenge, and her deep commitment to the needs of people and to kindness and getting on together. So if I just stop for a minute, or a bit less than a minute actually, but just to give us a chance for all of us just to think about Jo and what she did. And just to say to all Jo's family out there who are probably watching this, I think, just remember there are lots of us with you out there. Now, as Jo would have said, let's get on with it then. So, now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, who's the Right Honourable Jacqui Smith. Jackie's background is that she went to Oxford University, she became a teacher, and she went into politics. She was MP for Redditch in Birmingham from 1997 to 2010, and was in the government too, first as a Minister in Health, and then she became the first female Home Secretary in the UK. So that's a pretty startling background anyway. Since that time, she's been chairing all sorts of things, including a massive NHS trust in Birmingham. But perhaps the most important one for us all today is that she is chair of the Joe Cox Foundation. So I think Jackie's the perfect person to speak today. COVID obviously has been absolutely devastating, as the film said, so much suffering and has increased inequality. So it was great today to hear Jacqui, who's, I think, someone very close to Jo's heart, to talk about some of the issues that have, emerged and developed as we've gone through this recent period. So over to you, Jacqui.
Thank you, Barbara. Today is 5 years since Jo's death. Since hatred and political violence spilled over into the killing of my friend. Campaigner, advocate, politician, and more importantly, to those who had the joy of knowing her personally, friend, sister, daughter, wife, and mum. We remember and we grieve. We send love to those who were closest to her. But in keeping with her life, it is also the time for us to care, to challenge, to act, to live fully and to laugh. It's through her life, her values, and her work that we remember her and that we ensure that we love like Jo. As the chair of the Jo Cox Foundation, I'm delighted to be here in Cambridge today to deliver this annual Cambridge Memorial Lecture. Thank you to the University Department of Sociology and to Murray Edwards College for your ongoing support and hosting of the lecture. This is the fourth. And can I say, given the year we've had, and in the spirit of the new hybrid world that we live in, it is lovely to be here in person. But it's also lovely to be joined virtually by several hundred friends, supporters, and others who are inspired by Jo. It seems only right to start by reflecting on Jo's time here at Cambridge. I asked Jo's friend and my fellow Joe Cox Foundation trustee, Steve Morris, about Jo and Cambridge. He said, "Overwhelmingly, laughter is what I remember. Yes, there were some tears. I doubt many people get through university without a few. But most of the time, we had industrial quantities of fun." Jo was full of energy and enthusiasm. She threw herself into college life as welfare rep, rowing in the bumps, as a college mum. She buzzed about town, jogging, going to lectures, occasionally troubling a librarian. And he goes on to say, "I think some of us, I for one, underestimated Jo. Maybe it was a lingering prejudice about a small northern woman." And recalling an evening towards the end of their university days when they were wondering aloud what they'd be doing with their lives, when it came to Jo, her reply was, "I dunno, Boutros, Jo?" As it turned out, it wasn't so very far from the reality. I met Jo when she was the first elected chair at Labour Women's Network, where she was encouraging other women to stand for Parliament, to take part in political life. She was enthusiastic and inclusive, and we got on straight away. She was doing that whilst caring for, being pregnant with, and giving birth to Coolin and Layla. In London, Jo lived on a boat moored in Wapping, and those of us on the committee loved holding meetings in the community room that formed part of those moorings. We got to hold the babies, whilst Jo chaired the meetings and Brendan popped in with her tea. Although none of us will forget the occasion when we invited an expert on electoral arithmetic to talk to us about the implications of a boundary reorganisation on women's chances of getting elected. As he expounded his analysis, the boats going by and the tide caused a gentle rocking of the mooring. Whilst that may have been very comforting for the babies, I'm afraid it caused the poor man to get greener and greener until he had to stop and retire to the bathroom. Children, adventure, campaigning, and fun fill my memories of Jo. I was enormously honoured when she came to me for advice on seeking the selection for the Batley and Spen parliamentary seat. She didn't really need it, though. She was clear that that was the only seat she really wanted to fight. She'd campaigned internationally and nationally and wanted to do that as an MP. But she wanted to do it on behalf of and with the support of the people she had grown up with. She wanted to be their voice and their champion, and it is not surprising that they put their faith in her. I have a feeling and a hope that she will soon be followed by another proud, energetic and vocal Batley and Spen leadbeater, Kim, a sister in every sense. I'm now proud to chair the Jo Cox Foundation, set up to build on Jo's values and work and to build a positive legacy. Our vision is for a kinder, more compassionate society where every individual has a sense of belonging and where we recognise that we have more in common than that which divides us. Yes, you will recognise that phrase from Jo's maiden speech. There is no doubt that Jo was an excellent MP. She would have gone far, possibly to the very top in politics, and her values and talent were clear from that maiden speech onwards. Parliamentary colleagues talk of Jo's energy, her comradeship, but also her willingness to reach across political divides to deliver on the issues she believed in. Like the best politicians in our system, she understood the need to work locally, nationally, and internationally. And this is the approach we take in the Foundation. In the last year, when the world has faced the enormous challenges of the COVID pandemic, I've often found myself asking, what would Jo have done? Where would she have devoted her energy? What change would she have prioritised? And this has also been at the heart of how the Foundation has responded to this difficult time. My conclusion is that she would have focused on three broad areas. Firstly, given the work she had started on loneliness and her emphasis on the strength of community, she would have wanted to ensure that social distancing didn't translate into social isolation. Secondly, her political beliefs and absolute commitment to social justice would have given her a focus on how pre-existing inequalities have worsened the impact of the pandemic for some, and how the pandemic has worsened inequalities for many. Thirdly, she would have lifted her eyes from the local and even the national to consider the international ramifications of the pandemic and our responsibilities as world citizens. So how have we as the Foundation and as a country performed against those yardsticks? As the pandemic took hold last year, we were revving up to deliver the great get-together. Our annual celebration and exhortation of community, of finding what unites us rather than divides us, and also, as Jo would have insisted, to have fun. But as we were thinking of getting together, the country was being told to stay at home and to keep apart. How could we reconcile that with our message of drawing closer, tackling isolation and loneliness, and finding the things we share? I'm enormously proud that our response was to innovate, to convene, and to prompt new action. This was the instinct for many, of course, particularly at the beginning of lockdown. Even as we were locked down, we found ways to link up. Trying to keep up with Joe Wicks, bragging about our sourdough bread. I have to confess, I didn't even manage a banana loaf. And whilst I'm in a confessional mood, I also have to say that I haven't yet delivered my turn at the family Zoom quiz. I chair the largest NHS trust in England and the one which saw the most COVID cases. Our staff were magnificent, and the NHS continues to deliver with a vaccination programme which is our hope of emerging from this period of separation and sadness. People recognised the sacrifice and contribution of key workers, and we clapped on our doorsteps. On the 4th of July, we'll have the chance, through a thank you day, to celebrate all of those who kept us going through this time. We should be proud of what we achieved and how we got through. But we're also sadder and wiser now about the impact of the pandemic. Key workers had to step up with all the drudgery and fear and effort that involved. Across the NHS and beyond, people are feeling worn out and burnt out. Meanwhile, others were furloughed or lost their jobs completely and now live in economic fear for the future. And the emotional cost is high. We lost many people to this disease. But whilst all were affected, it didn't strike equally. If you have poor housing or a chronic long-term health condition, if you're in certain ethnic groups, if you're older, the toll was higher and the pain was greater. Loved ones in care homes were separated at a time when families most want to make the most of their time together. And for many, families and NHS and care staff, they had to experience the tragedy of people dying alone. The moment when we most need to draw together, families were forced apart. I worry about the impact of that on those who have lost loved ones during the pandemic. As many will be experiencing today, grief is never over. But some deaths are even more painful and even more difficult for others to bear. The lifting of lockdown, when it finally comes, is not the ending of pain, and there will be much to do to support people. Recognising that pain and the danger of separation and distance, at the Foundation we brought together the Connection Coalition. We brought together a network of organisations that were supporting individuals and communities through the pandemic as they faced intensified social and emotional crises, including loneliness, mental health issues and bereavement. In doing that, we hoped to coordinate and amplify efforts to reinforce meaningful connections and to help mitigate the impact of isolation on social and emotional well-being. In 2020, we recruited over 800 member organisations. We sent over 25 newsletters packed with helpful resources, updates and ideas, ran webinars for over 400 people and reached millions through our Community Makes Us campaign. Member numbers have continued to grow, and in consultation with members, it's clear that there is a desire for that Connection Coalition to continue as we navigate our way into that post-lockdown period. It will enable us to harness the power of strong relationships and connections for the future. Our focus then until at least October will be to provide spaces and opportunities for member organisations to come together to learn and to share through specific interest groups, through creating platforms to enable members to see the bigger picture beyond their own work and to get support from others working towards similar goals. And we weren't going to let physical distance prevent us from getting together either. There was a moment in early 2020 when people wondered if we should cancel the Great Get Together, but it really was just a moment. There is such imagination and joy in the work that people do for the Great Get Together. We had over 2 million participants in 2020. The virtual community interfaith service, featuring contributions from senior religious figures, has been viewed over 5,000 times. We estimate over 1,000 people took part in the Run for Joe, including in Australia and Vietnam. And this Sunday, thousands will be running again, including me. School assemblies happened across the country. But the power of the Great Get Together, and this is really important, both for Jo's philosophy and for the way the Foundation works, is in its ability to promote grassroots, local events, as well as national activity. There was an online quiz in Dartford based around famous women in politics and history. There were deliveries of picnic boxes in Harrogate to those isolating and shielding. An online dialogue held by Interfaith Scotland focused on tackling racism and standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was even a socially distanced street party in Llanwit for a couple whose wedding had been cancelled. We had really hoped that this year we'd be physically back together. But the energy and the imagination will be at play again this weekend when we hold the Great Get Together 2021. If you're not yet involved, please visit the website to see how you can get some of that Great Get Together action. The last year has been a universal challenge, but it hasn't affected us all equally. There has been considerable analysis of the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic, but I'm not sure that Jo would have been convinced that there's been enough political focus on mitigating them. Some ethnic groups have been impacted disproportionately by COVID, being more likely to catch it because of their frontline roles or crowded living conditions, and more likely to die from it due to comorbidities. Systemic racism has bred a mistrust, which is translated into vaccine hesitancy in some communities, putting them at further risk in this pandemic. People with disabilities may have been more prone to having serious effects if they caught COVID. And even if they haven't, health and care services that they need and depend on have been more difficult to access as they've had to deal with the pandemic. But I want to spend just a bit more time considering the gender impacts from the pandemic. Last year marked 25 years since the Beijing Declaration on Gender Equality. It was supposed to provide a focus for making further progress. In fact, the pandemic has rolled back progress that had been made. As the UN states, the pandemic is deepening pre-existing inequalities, exposing vulnerabilities in social, political, and economic systems, which are in turn amplifying the impacts of the pandemic. Across the world, women earn less, save less, and have less wealth. They are more likely to be in insecure jobs or poverty, so economic impacts fall harder on them. Men have been more likely to die from COVID, but women have been disproportionately caring for COVID patients and therefore more likely to have caught COVID in many countries. And the reallocation of resources needed to treat COVID across the world has impacted on health services for women, including maternity and sexual health services. Wider unpaid caring duties have been carried out by women. In the UK, research from the Women and Equalities Parliamentary Select Committee showed that as paid care reduced during the pandemic and children stayed at home more as schools closed, women took a disproportionately larger share of that unpaid care. An Essex University report a couple of weeks ago reported that mothers were more likely to experience mental health stress during the lockdown and school closures than men were. As economic and social stress increased during the pandemic and people were forced to spend more time at home and potentially isolated, gender-based violence increased massively. There has been growing demand on services which have also faced disruption due to the pandemic. Women have been forced into lockdown with their abusers, so it's likely that much more will have been hidden. We cannot allow these impacts to go unchecked or to fail to learn the lessons about why they occurred in the first place. What needs to change? Well, Jo and I campaigned for greater representation of women in political decision making. And that isn't only to ensure fair representation, but because more diverse teams make for better policy and better politics. Yesterday I read that Boris Johnson met with Rishi Sunak, Matt Hancock and Michael Gove to make the decision to extend lockdown provisions. That's been the core team making the big decisions during the pandemic. Let me be fair. This has been an enormously difficult period in government, a far larger crisis than I ever faced in my time. And I believe that the government deserves support in the difficult decisions that it's taking. But I also want them to do the best job in making those decisions. Now, thinking about that core team, and call me biased if you like, but I'm not clear why a female Home Secretary wasn't in the room whilst those decisions were being taken. And even more significantly, I can't help thinking that a few more women involved might have noticed that PPE wasn't reliably getting to the front line and wasn't always fitting well when it did, that care homes needed special attention, and that childcare is as important a part of our infrastructure as railways. To be fair, of course, this isn't only a British or even only a Tory problem. The family photo of 9 world leaders from this weekend's G7 summit in Cornwall only managed to include in it 2 women, and one of those is about to retire. Without women's voices at the heart of politics and decision-making across the world, we will continue to make bad decisions and we will fail to recover properly from the pandemic. There are other things that need to happen as well. As the cross-party Women and Equalities Select Committee argues, we also need proper equality impact assessments of the investment and policies to build back after the pandemic. It's right that there is money being spent, and I hope we will continue to invest in building back. But it's got to be focused in the areas that will be both most effective and will tackle those inequalities that caused the pandemic to be worse in the first place. And as the UN recommends, we need transformation in the care economy, paid and unpaid, so that jobs are no longer paid less in care than they are in other sectors. And that we recognise that women continue to do the bulk of unpaid caring with all of the implications, both economic and social, that brings with it. Jo was an internationalist, an aid worker, a campaigner for social justice at home and abroad. She would incidentally never have accepted that the cost of the pandemic in the UK is an excuse to cut the international aid projects that we support abroad. We're proud that the Foundation has been able to work with the FCDO and formerly the Department for International Aid to develop and fund projects aimed at empowering women to tackle the complex political, social and economic disadvantages they face, and also grants that will strengthen the ability of communities to predict and to prevent identity-based violence, including mass atrocities. The projects supported through the fund include women's advocacy projects in Uganda and Kenya, carers associations across the world working for practical support and a stronger voice for those women carrying out caring responsibilities, empowering women with disabilities in Nigeria, building women's voices and agency in Nepal and Uganda, and using men as allies and champions to tackle male attitudes and the barriers that too often keep women out. Providing work placements for disadvantaged young women in Zimbabwe. I think Jo would have been proud of the scale and the purpose of what's being achieved there. And projects in Iraq, South Sudan, the DRC and Burundi to strengthen civil society organisations to tackle and to resist identity-based violence and mass atrocities. And Jo always saw this work as being too important for tribal party interests, and she built alliances and friendships with Tory MPs like Tom Tugendhat and Andrew Mitchell, to argue for intervention to prevent atrocities, including in Syria, and to argue for the types of projects that can transform the life and the rights of people across the world. We try to keep this part of Jo's voice and work going in the foundation. And I have to say, I know that Jo would now be joining the cross-party campaign to protect the 0.7% of GDP aid commitment. And she would know that tackling the pandemic needs the world to be vaccinated. I'm not sure that the 1 billion doses of vaccine, welcome though they were, promised to the world by the G7 last week, would have cut the mustard for her. So in conclusion, the pandemic has brought out the best in us, and it's identified the worst in the world we live in. We've rediscovered the strength of community as we clapped together, volunteered together, and supported each other. We've realised the importance of connection, even whilst we've been forced to distance. We now have graphic evidence that we are one world. What starts thousands of miles away will end up on our streets and in our homes. We know that we cannot insulate ourselves by standing apart. None of us will be safe until we are all safe. And talking about inequality isn't an academic nicety, or woke, or indulging in a culture war. It has real-life implications for our health, our jobs, our children's education, our lives, and our deaths. We've never needed Jo's values, her commitment, and her priorities more. Thank goodness for her life, her example, and her memory.
Thank you so much for your speech, Jacqui. I'm sure we can all agree that your highlighting of all the inequalities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic really shows us the value of Jo Cox's legacy and her values of a kinder and fairer politics. So, to introduce myself, I'm Safa Al-Azami, and I'm the chair of the Jo Cox Feminist Society, which was founded in 2018 in Pembroke College. I'm also a first-year undergraduate studying at Pembroke, and I just want to begin the Q&A to say I've taken a lot of inspiration from Jo's life. I studied the renewed version of the course that she ended up switching to, which is now Human, Social and Political Sciences, and of course at the very same college she studied at. And as Jacqui said, I'm also a small northern woman, so I really do relate to her sort of experiences coming into Cambridge University. And this has also pushed me to become the chair of the Jo Cox Feminist Society, which meets fortnightly to discuss global feminist issues, from feminist protests to intersectionality. And Jo's work on humanitarian issues such as in Darfur and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and her focus on women's rights has been a source of inspiration for the Jo Cox Feminist Society as well. Having been a student during the pandemic whilst living away from home for the first time also shows how important it is to tackle the issue of loneliness more than ever, especially for students during university. It's been an honour to be able to continue her legacy through the feminist society we have at Pembroke, and I'm really honoured to participate in this event with Jacqui and the Jo Cox Foundation. So yeah, and without further ado, I'd like to open up to the Q&A for Jacqui Smith.
Safa, before you start, can I just say, am I right? And when we're talking about commitment and energy, you are a good example of it. Were you doing an exam this morning?
I was doing an exam. Right. The exam was meant to last until 5:30, but magically the exam was went really well, and so I was able to submit it early. They did give us extended time because of COVID, so that's why I was able to submit it. So I've arrived from an exam.
Well, you are brilliant.
My last exam as well, so I'm going on
really?
a high note. Yes.
Okay, good.
If those of you who are watching online via the live stream would like to submit your questions, please go ahead. But for the first question, I'd like to refer to Saliha Ahsan in the audience.
Hello, thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. By background, I was invited to come along today, and it was an incredible honour because I had followed Jo's work, particularly so on Syria. My background before I came to Cambridge is that of a medical doctor. I'm also a broadcaster and I make films. 2013, we made a panorama about the impact on attacks against healthcare in Syria for children. After the film was made, we were involved in a lot of advocacy work and reaching out to other groups. Obviously, at this point, we encountered Jo's work on Syria. Not only her work on Syrian refugees arriving in the UK, but also those that were unable to leave and who were stuck in an awful situation in Syria. And her role as the co-chair of the APPG on Syria was phenomenal. It was legendary, and I was guided to it very early on. I often, since her death, I have thought, if only Jo was here, what would she say now? What would she say about what is happening now that the last paediatrician in Aleppo has just been killed? What would she say had she known that the Syrian government have now got a place on the WHO's executive board? What would she say that we have now marked the 10-year anniversary of Syria? How, in addition, I'm here now doing my PhD because of her inspiration, I'll put it out there, and the ongoing work that is needed on Syria and in other conflict zones where healthcare is being attacked. So my PhD is looking at that. And had Jo been here, I would have been sending her my research. I would have been inviting her to come and speak at events that I'm trying to run on this issue. What is the Joe Cox Foundation doing in this world, in this area, so that I can still continue to connect with her legacy and her work that she started?
Firstly, can I say I think had you sent your work to her, she would have used it to enormously good effect in the chamber of the House of Commons, in building the alliances across party that she built, in challenging ministers, in giving a voice to it. And she would have done it with her usual panache and energy. Because of that, one of the pillars of our work in the foundation is that international work, and that takes two forms in particular. Firstly, it is the funding work, the grants program that we do with the the FCDO. Which is aimed particularly at, as I said, both empowering women, but also looking at how to build civil society in a way that's going to help us to mitigate and avoid future atrocities and identity-based violence. But we've also continued to support Jo's work on the responsibility to protect, and, for example, some of her work around that has been continued by Alison McGovern, MP, in part, once again on a cross-party basis, to keep those arguments in the political world alongside the practical support that the aid that is being supported through the Jo Cox Foundation grants is also helping to put in place. So I hope that you would find that this is something which is significant to the foundation and something that we're continuing to do, and that you will hear the echo of Jo's voice in Parliament and amongst her colleagues in terms of the political emphasis that is placed on it as well.
Thank you for your question. So we've got some questions sent in advance as well. So Roberta Ritson asks, what the pandemic has highlighted is a marginalisation of the very elderly and the mental health of all age groups. How, as a society, do we nurture the worth of every human being, creating systems which prevent, not fuel, loneliness and despair?
I think this comes back to what I was talking about in terms of connection and isolation. And I think it would have been, I hope that we've been imaginative in the way in which we have, through the Connection Coalition or through the Great Get-Together, thought about those issues about how we actually bring people together, how we strengthen communities in the Connection Coalition, how we support organisations who are already working in the areas of mental health or loneliness or bereavement. And I do think that the treatment of the elderly during the course of this pandemic is something that has been heartbreaking and in many cases wrong. And I'm sure it is something that Jo would have felt very, very strongly about. And I think we need to keep pushing on those things in a sort of, in the way in which we certainly tried to do in the foundation, and I think it was part of sort of Jo's thinking about how you achieve change. And that is both through sort of national policy, campaigning, advocacy, and also the encouragement of precisely the type of grassroots activity or local organisation that is bringing about those changes on the ground. And it's that sort of dual approach that I think is certainly what we're trying to do in the foundation, and is probably the most effective way of bringing about that change.
The next question is from Victoria Gregson, and she asks, what can be learnt from the legacy of Jo Cox in responding to misinformation and the promulgation of conspiracy theories with regards to the pandemic and the vaccines?
This is difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the things that I didn't talk about so much, but the sort of middle pillar, if you like, of what we do in the foundation relates to work particularly about public life and abuse in public life. So it came about firstly because of first of all, because clearly the far extreme of political hatred is when it spills over into murder, as it did with Jo. But that actually further back down that spectrum, there is a level of abuse on social media, but not only on social media, but probably made worse by social media, that also, if we're not careful, puts people off coming into public life, and that is bad for democracy as a whole, not just for individuals. But what we're also seeing in that sphere, I think you're right, is the ability for what might have been seen as minority or minority views or conspiracy theories to get more prominence than they would otherwise get. And we are, I think the question is right to say, at the moment, of course, one of the places that we're seeing that is in the dissemination of information that is just plain wrong, that is scaring people about the vaccination programme, and is ensuring that those people and communities, in many cases, who most need the vaccination are more hesitant about taking it up. I think, what would Jo's approach have been to that? I mean, I think, once again, it would have been, two-sided. First of all, I think it would have been an openness in wanting to sort of robustly take on some of those arguments, whilst recognising people's fear, engaging in conversations with people. My experience of the vaccination programme is where people are hesitant. I've been a bit impatient at times over the last year. Why aren't people having the vaccine? But actually what I've seen is sometimes the most successful way of dealing with that has been individual conversations, whether that's GPs or community representatives. Just this week in Birmingham, we've taken vans out into communities so that they're more easily accessible to people, family members persuading other family members, and we're beginning to see an impact there. But I think it would also have been pressure on, and they're beginning to respond to it, but pressure on those places where that type of misinformation is promulgated, and there I think we're back to social media companies and other media organisations, and there I think we do need to keep pushing those organisations to recognise that there is evidence, there are facts, and there is disinformation, and those things are not equal. And unless you're willing to take action against disinformation, unless you're willing to stand up for objective evidence, then you will undermine trust, and you will damage people in the way in which we've seen.
I think it's really interesting how you brought up how like community can sort of provide a solution to these sorts of issues and these divisions, especially because obviously Brexit has caused so many divisions throughout the past few years. So wondering whether you see hope in the pandemic sort of bringing people together as a community and making people realise that the current system of divisive politics and inequality just can't work, and that we need to work as a collective society to help each other.
I do see hope in that. I think there is much, I focused in what I talked about on, or quite a lot of my focus was on some of the sort of things that have become worse during the course of the pandemic. But there is no doubt that during the course of the last 15 months, we have seen people recognise the strength of their local communities. Frankly, sometimes it's because you're spending more time at home. Actually, it is. And speaking for myself, going up the road to get a coffee from the local independent coffee shop, as opposed to getting it from Birmingham New Street Station as I go into work, has been a lovely thing about the pandemic. Getting to know my neighbours better as we stood outside and clapped on a Thursday night has been a positive thing about the pandemic. People finding the connections in their communities, supporting each other through difficult times, looking out for each other, checking people have got food, that type of thing, I think has grown more over the last year. And that's precisely what we've been trying to achieve through the Great Get Together. And you heard in what we now need to do, and I think you heard in the introductory film from the foundation, is, what we now need to do is to turn that from a moment to a movement. And in terms of the pandemic, we need to keep that good stuff that's happened during the pandemic and think about the ways that we can develop that and embed it.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Nisha Jani, and they ask, what do you think Jo's political legacy should be for the UK generally, more particularly for women, and perhaps most especially for women in politics?
I think it's, first of all, do it, right? Don't be, I think Jo would be, notwithstanding the tragedy of what happened to Jo, it would be devastating if people took a lesson from that, which was stay out of politics. Because, as I said, I met Jo when she was the chair of Labour Women's Network, which was all about encouraging women into politics. And she was always wanting to do that and to make sure that women got involved. I think then it would be that recognition of what I think in many ways we do quite well in the British political system, which is everything from your constituency activity through to your sort of national political activity and hopefully your contribution to the world as a whole, whether or not that's through particular foreign policy issues as Jo was interested in, or more broadly in terms of what we can do as a country. So I think those are the things that people take from Jo's life, and just an incredible can-do attitude. There wasn't, and one other thing that I'll come to in a minute, the thing about Jo was, there wasn't, and we say this a lot in the foundation, there wasn't a too difficult box. Right? If something was really tricky, whilst other politicians might be thinking, oh, that's going to be a bit difficult to solve, I'm not quite sure how to do that, Jo would have been in there trying to get it sorted out. And in doing that, she'd have been building alliances. Some of her colleagues, I'd left Parliament by the time Jo arrived, and I was talking to one of her colleagues just the other day who said, oh, we were all slightly nervous when Jo arrived and sort of made a beeline for Tories and others. Because, there is something very tribal about being within Parliament. Now, that wasn't because she wasn't political. It wasn't because she didn't have extremely strong values. It was because she thought to herself, right, if I'm going to get things done, I need to build an alliance. And if there are people over there who are going to help me to get them done, let's do it.
That's good advice for anyone wanting to enter politics as a woman. I've also got a question from Aram Saeed, who says, I'm a tutor in Surrey. I have a strong affinity with Jo Cox. We were born in the same year, and her death really affected me a great deal. They ask, Jo spoke of getting on, regardless of who we affiliate with. Should we not all try to stop racist and extremist entities and candidates and promote tolerance, not ignorance?
Yes, we should, through challenge, through argument, through, there is some, sometimes where it's possible to do it by finding what unites us rather than what divides us. And some of the things that we now do in the foundation are about, action that brings together people who have politically very, very different positions, or who perhaps come from very, very different backgrounds, in order to find those uniting things and to get something positive out of doing that. But I mean, that is really, really important. But sometimes actually what you need is pretty robust political challenge where there is a racist or a wholly illegitimate argument. And I have no doubt that, I know that Jo would have been completely capable of doing that. And I think we all have a responsibility to stand up to that hatred and intolerance where we find it.
Thank you. And last question from the question sent in advance is one from Colin Wilson, who asks, what do you think was Jo's greatest achievement?
I think she'd say it was her kids. And they are fabulous and adventurous and fun. So I think that's what she would say. In terms of the public sphere, I think winning Batley and Spen and doing such a good job, which obviously in the current context is to say the least topical, because in a fortnight there will be another election there. And then I think it probably would have been the start of her work cross-party around issues like Syria and I'm sure, knowing Jo, I suspect, like all good constituency MPs, and she was a bloody good one, I suspect there are projects in Batley and Spen that have got her name on them and that she helped to sort of kick into action that she'd also have been very proud of.
I do really think that her cross-party work really shows how political divisiveness and party divisions isn't what makes politics in this country, and you can have cross-party alliances to build on political values that everyone shares. So I think that is one of my main points of inspiration, at least.
I think that's true, Safa, and I think it is inspiring, but let's not, as long as we don't fall into the trap of thinking that was because she didn't think there were differences in politics.
Oh, no, of course
she
not.
did think there were differences in politics. She did have a very strong set of political values and views, but she also wanted to achieve change. So she wasn't interested in a sort of, exposition of political views. She was interested in change. Mm-hmm. And in order to achieve the things she believed in, she was willing to form those alliances.
Mm-hmm. So we now can move on to questions sent in from the online live stream. So Magnus Bonner asks, thank you so much for hosting this, and asks, what does the foundation see as the largest threat to the society Jo Cox was trying to create?
That's a very good argument, very good question, challenging question. I think things that there are obviously specifics. You spoke about Brexit, and I think whatever side of that particular argument you've been on, there was a danger that it created quite a lot of political division. But it's not only that, it's also the things that tend to atomise us in our communities rather than bring us together. It's the things that cause people to take positions where they can't shift or see other viewpoints and find a way through those. I think, and then it's sort of the impact of the bad impact of social media, because I believe that there are many good things about social media. We use it in the Joe Cox Foundation for for our campaigning, but there are elements of the way that amplifies particular voices that I think are divisive and disruptive in society. And I suppose most of all it would be a sort of fatalism or a view that things can't change, because we believe that they can, and we think if you bring together the right people and you give them the right support, things will change at both a community and a national and an international level.
Mm-hmm. I think that hope is really important, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So the next question is from Chan Palmer, and they ask, what more could we as a society and government do to reduce hate crime rising, which creates divisions in our community? I think we have touched on that a bit before.
Yeah, I think we have a bit. I mean, with my former Home Secretary hat on, I have to say I think that we have made quite a lot of progress in recent years in recognising it as a crime. The work, the campaign, the apparently successful campaign to get misogyny seen as a hate crime, I think is important. There was some resistance from the police because of their worry about resourcing, but I think to call something that is a crime is actually quite an important start in beginning to tackle it. So I think those things are important as well. The Home Secretary in me always likes a bit of sort of law and order and sanction around this.
I think especially with Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement last year, I think one of the more important things has also been sort of the awareness and the empowerment of marginalised groups and marginalised people, and sort of calling for more representation and a larger voice. So what sort of role do you think this has, and how does this relate, do you think, to Jo Cox's legacy?
That type of positive campaign, which came out of, a terrible tragedy and a killing, but that then brought those voices to the fore, that enabled people to publicly demonstrate a commitment to the principles of Black Lives Matters, that caused, I think, lots of organisations, all of the organisations I'm involved with, and us at the Foundation, to rethink our approach to anti-racism and to the way in which we were tackling that, I think has been very positive and powerful. I mean, of course, it creates, rightly sometimes, it creates a tension and an argument. And then I think you have to choose which side you're on. And frankly, given that we're in the middle of the Euros, I'm pleased that some of our most successful and high-profile sportsmen are currently still continuing to take a knee at the beginning of each football match. I'm angry that people are booing that, and I'm pleased that our Prime Minister, even if not our Home Secretary, believes that it's wrong to boo people taking the knee.
So the next question is from Sarah Franklin. She asks, the Conservative advisor Samuel Kasuma has resigned over the current government's commitment to division. He claims they have entirely forgotten Jo Cox. How can we oppose the government's short-term divisiveness? I didn't always achieve Jo's ability to not be tribal, I have to say, in my political life, and I will try and avoid it today. So I think that there are significant numbers of politicians on all sides of the argument, all sides of the political divide, who don't want there to be the sort of divisiveness, culture wars, whatever you want to call them, who don't believe that that is an area of our politics that should be sort of weaponised. And I think the time is right for them to stand up and be clear about that now, because I also think there is a little bit of evidence that there are some people
who want to take reasonably peripheral issues like whether or not you've got a photo of the Queen in your common room and turn that somehow into a sort of test of Britishness, which it absolutely isn't. And I think politicians have got to be very, very careful that they don't go down that route, because it is dangerous, it is divisive, and it plays to the worst of this country as opposed to the best.
The next question is from Rachel Jones. They say, well said, Jacqui Smith. We must encourage people into public life, especially women. But what else can be done to make that happen? And what would Jo do?
I think all sorts of things, from the type of training and campaigning that Jo did, in her case within the Labour Party, but which is now increasingly being done by women in other political parties, by emphasising that, as I hope I did in the speech, that this is about justice and representation for individual women, but more fundamentally, it's about whether or not you have a good representative politics, which is making the best decisions. And I think when you've had in front of you a cast iron example of what happens if you don't have women involved in decision making, and it isn't as good, then that gives you the case that you then need to make as to why you need to have more women. I think it needs mentoring and support from those of us who've done it to those who are keen to do it, and I hope I take my responsibility as a former recovering politician to do that, to encourage others in. It needs people to champion, men and women, to be champions and allies of other people who perhaps aren't typical politician fodder, but without whom we will have a worse democracy and a worse parliament and a worse political system.
And we've also got a question from Uz Gonzalez, who says, thank you for sharing her memorial. I would ask whether the foundation is doing anything to continue her ideas about Europe, since this was part of the context behind her murder.
Well, not directly, no, in the foundation. I think what we would, except there was and has been some quite interesting work through some of the local more in common groups who, after the referendum, did bring together people from different sides of the Brexit argument in order to find what they had in common as opposed to what divided them. I'm not sure, and this isn't cowardice, I'm not sure the foundation is best placed to continue an argument about our membership or not of the European Union or the implications of Brexit. I mean, individually, I'm perfectly happy to have that row and frequently do, but I'm not convinced it is a priority for the foundation at the moment.
Thank you. And we've also got a question from Manali Desai, who's the head of Department of Sociology here at the University of Cambridge. She says, thank you for such a lovely tribute to Jo's life and work. My question is what Jo might have done in response to recent government cuts to foreign aid, which have been rationalised in terms of the decline in economic growth because of COVID.
Well, I'm absolutely certain she would have been at the heart of what is a cross-party campaign. I think she would have been working, as she did in life, with Andrew Mitchell and others on this. I'm both shocked that the government has gone down this route, given the manifesto commitment, given the strong support, to be fair to the Conservative Party, that there was from former Conservative Prime Ministers as well as others for this. And I am hopeful that the alliance that is being built around this, I mean, frankly, in political terms, if you can get everybody from, all of the opposition through to people in the Tory party, from Andrew Mitchell to David Davis, on the same side and putting their shoulder to it, I'm a bit hopeful that we might see this change. I think it is, Rishi Sunak has been right to spend a considerable amount of money on mitigating the impacts of the pandemic, and he's wholly wrong to make this, in that context, relatively small cut. And I sort of have faith in people's good sense. And actually the other thing, the positive thing here as well is, let's not forget, 10 years ago, making the case for, making a mainstream case for that aid target was not something where you would have gained an enormous amount of support in the Tory party. Give David Cameron his due. He changed the Tory party to support it. And I think that consensus lives on, and I hope it will prevail in the end.
So we are coming close to the end of the Q&A, but I did want to ask one more question.
Oh, this is the point at which you ask me something really difficult, and I get into trouble.
I just sort of wondered, because of sort of encouraging women to go into politics, just thinking, how do you balance sort of encouraging women and other minorities to enter into politics, have their voice heard, and make changes with the need for these people to be able to take care of themselves and remove themselves from spaces which aren't conducive to their own well-being? How do you strike that balance, especially as a woman in politics yourself?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that you, in thinking about a political career, that you take care of yourself, that you recognise that self-care is an incredibly significant part of your ability to be able to achieve your political objectives, that you build around you a support network of people who will help you to do that. My view of politics is it isn't a sort of individual activity, it's a team sport, and you need to make sure you've got your team supporting you. And then the most significant thing is, I think those of us who are no longer in frontline politics, but who want to see women and people from different backgrounds coming into politics, have to take responsibility for protecting them when they step up. And that means even if you don't agree with their politics as well. So I'm strongly of the view that we need to call out those people who are abusing people in public life, and we need to protect and honour those people who do take that step. Criticise those who question their motives. The vast majority of people who go into political life are doing it because they believe that there is something positive that they can contribute. They might be wrong in their politics as far as I'm concerned, but it is an honourable thing that they're engaged in, and the rest of us, if we want a lively democracy, have a responsibility to protect them and encourage them in doing that.
Thank you so much for answering these questions and giving such an amazing lecture. That's all the time we have for questions. So we will be closing the event with a video from Jo Cox's sister, Kim Ledbeater, MBE. And so yeah, thank you again for some questions. I'd also like to thank the audience for asking questions. And I would also like to thank Jo's incredible family and all the volunteers who do amazing work in Jo's name across the UK in the Joe Cox Foundation and other work that's been inspired by her to continue her legacy and hopefully strive for a more fair and equal politics. Thank you.
Hello everybody. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been involved in today's lecture. Massive thanks to Jackie for delivering a beautiful tribute to Jo and a really powerful and informative lecture. And a huge thanks to everybody at Cambridge University, the Department of Sociology, Murray Edwards College, and of course the amazing Joe Cox Foundation team. It's been a really wonderful event. The 16th of June will always be an incredibly emotional and difficult day for our family. But it is really heartwarming for me and my parents and all Jo's family and friends to think that this event was taking place on this day. So 5 years on since Jo's murder, a lot has been achieved, a lot has been done through the work of the Joe Cox Foundation and by many, many people around the country and indeed around the world. Internationally, we have the fantastic Joe Cox Memorial Grants taking place in countries all around the world. Nationally, we've seen huge amounts of progress on the Foundation's work on civility in public life and the way that we conduct ourselves in the political arena. And locally, across the whole country, but in communities up and down this brilliant country of ours. We've seen great get-together events taking place every year in June on what would have been Jo's birthday, and we've seen the development and the growth of the More in Common network of community groups, bringing people together at a local level. So it's wonderful to think that all these things have happened in Jo's name, and I'm incredibly grateful to every single person who's been involved in this really powerful and important work. But, as Jo would say, and as I would say, lots done, but still lots more to do. So let's build on this work. Let's build on the things that we've achieved and created during the last 5 years to make Jo's legacy even more powerful and more impressive. Let's work together on the issues that she cared about and on the issues that we all care about. Thank you once again for making today such a special event. It's such a shame we couldn't do it in real life, but hopefully I will get to meet with many, many of you in the coming months and years as we continue Jo's legacy and we get together in person. Thank you very much, everybody.